Thanks for joining us today in Brevard. I'm Matt Reed. Straight ahead, we'll talk schools, roads, taxes, and gubernatorial politics. And joining me here at Florida Today are two of my favorite media colleagues. To the right is Bill Mick, host of top-rated Bill Mick Live on WMMBAM. And on the left is John Glisch, editorial page editor here at Florida Today. Welcome, gentlemen. Let's jump right into some news from Tuesday night. The Brevard County School Board, which faces smaller budget cuts than initially feared, nevertheless may vote to raise property taxes by $0.25 mil to generate an additional $8 million in revenue per year. This is part of the legislature's plan for funding schools. Bill, John, let's take a look at what those numbers mean. First, the tax increase on a home assessed at $200,000 minus a homestead exemption works out to about $43 per year, or $3.65 per month if you escrow. But does the district need the money? Here are the meaningful losses coming to Brevard Public Schools, as I see them, taking them from district documents. Nearly $8.3 million in state spending cuts, another $8.3 million in declining tax revenues due to the sagging real estate market, and a cut of $8.6 million to school renovations and construction due to a legislative mandate to spend that money to plug other holes in operations. The tax increase would replace about 1/3 of that. Now, here are some of the key spending cuts Superintendent Richard DePatry has proposed without the additional $8 million. 271 administrators, custodians, clerks, and aides will be laid off. 87 teachers will get the boot. District share of sports funding will be cut in half, although no elimination of teams. And there will be no new textbooks, at least not for the next year or two. Bill, I know you've been talking about this on the program a little bit. What's your take on school taxes?
In this economy, any new tax is going to be a tough sell for any governmental entity. Nobody wants to see schools harmed. Nobody wants to see people lose their jobs. The reality is schools have been treated better than anybody else in this government from the top down, from the state level to the local. They've been taken care of pretty well. It's going to be a tough sell to get an extra tax out of people here.
John, what's your take?
I think the district might, the board, excuse me, might very well go ahead and do it. They need a supermajority vote. That's what the legislature passed down to do this on their own this year.
That means 4 out of 5.
That means 4 out of 5. The provision then being that next year in November they'd have to take it to voters to get that on the books permanently. I think they're going to probably do it because they really don't have much of a choice. Under the state constitution, the legislature is designated as having a funding education. That is their paramount responsibility. Yet this year, the legislature is only kicking in 45% of the Brevard County's school district budget. 50% is coming from local taxpayers. The legislators keep shifting the burden more and more down to local taxpayers so they don't have to make the tough choices in Tallahassee. And that other critical 5% this year is coming from President Obama's economic stimulus plan. I know school district officials have told us that the money that they're getting from the feds this year through stimulus is $24.3 million in this budget that they're working on, and that money is absolutely critical to saving teacher jobs in the district. I think that the school board will probably go along with this. How it'll play out next year, I don't know, but I think there is a potential of making a good case to voters that we're in extraordinary times. It demands extraordinary responses, and if you want to consider schools in the same category as police and fire as essential public services, I think they could maybe do it.
Bill, well, go ahead.
I think the responsibility for the school district is to manage properly and to allocate those funds. You mentioned the stimulus, John. Those funds come in with heavy strings attached, going to specific programs only. And while that may free up some funds for other things, it doesn't really look like that's how it's going to happen. So I think it's a mistake to rely on stimulus. I think it's a mistake to come to the taxpayers and say, we need more money now. I agree with the idea that you make the decision locally, and the more of this we can make local decisions with our elected leaders that we put in office locally making those calls, the better off we're going to be, because they'll be held accountable by the voters for what happens.
Do you think that the legislature was responsive to what people locally said they wanted to see out of the legislature in terms of school spending?
To a degree, yes. I mean, I think that they were put in a position, you used the word that they were embarrassed, I think it's maybe putting it mildly. They were in a position, not just the local delegation, but all of them up in Tallahassee, where they had to do something. I mean, they essentially found themselves in a position where the Mississippi River was reaching a record flood stage, and they had to do everything they could to sandbag and build a big levee and stick their fingers in the holes to try to prevent it from coming over and just having devastating cuts in school districts across the state. They managed to do that primarily through stimulus, which saved their hides. They also did it by conservatives going along with tax increases for cigarettes. The gambling compact with the Seminoles, those were important elements in the whole picture.
Okay, so they put together this whole package, or they strung together a bunch of different things.
But it's spit and baling wire.
Right, because the big thing is they
really what it
pass
was,
down to the local districts this responsibility, or this option, as they put it, to take the property taxes up another $250,000, as we explained a little bit earlier.
And the really hard work, the really big question of how do you restructure Florida's tax system to make it fair and make it equitable and provide the kinds of funding that you're going to need down the road in 2 years when the stimulus money runs out, where you're not relying on what one University of Central Florida economist has called the Ponzi scheme of relying on growth to pay for everything. They wouldn't touch it. They refused to touch looking at closing corporate tax loopholes. They absolutely refused to look at removing some of the exemptions, primarily which benefit special interests. But they stuck it to a lot of little guys. You're going to pay more to register your car. You're going to pay more, I think, for divorce. You're going to wind up paying more to get a fishing license to surf fish, which
and
is
some licenses you wouldn't have had.
Which is something I like to do,
Bill,
and that's how they got away with it.
Do you consider fees to be the same as taxes?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, let's move on to roads, specifically Palm Bay's lousy roads. Last week, Palm Bay voters rejected a proposed $75 million bond and tax measure that would have repaved about half of the roads and fixed drainage problems in Brevard's most populous city. The measure would have increased property taxes by about $80 a year on the typical house, and in a special election that drew less than 13% of registered voters, 56% voted no and about 43% voted yes. John, your editorial said that Palm Bay is stuck in a ditch. You want to explain?
Yeah, it sure is. What Bill alluded to earlier, trying to pass anything like this in this recession is extremely tough, if not impossible. And so it failed, even though I thought it was crafted very well. Go after 300 miles of roads to repair and repave, 150-some drainage projects, great transparency. You could go to a website, see where everything was in the city, and even right down the streets in your neighborhood, and it's still tanked. But in 2005, when the economy was booming and Palm Bay was humming, and there was a lot of money being made, they put a similar referendum before voters, and it tanked too. I think the inescapable conclusion is that too few people in Palm Bay want to address this issue, which is just horrendous infrastructure in Brevard's largest city. And it's going to continue to really cause the city problems in terms of simple quality of life, trying to get around on these roads as the city continues to grow, which it eventually will when the economy turns around. And also trying to bring in new businesses. I mean, businesses and industries, that's one of the key things they look for, is infrastructure. And it ain't there in Palm Bay, and they're going to have a devil of a time on that economic development front as a result.
Bill.
$80 a year for roads, $43 a year for schools. When's it going to stop? You can't keep going back to the taxpayer and asking them to keep bailing out irresponsible government. It's time for appropriate management at these various levels of government, whether it's the city, whether it's the school board. Take a look at what you've got, realize we're in tough times, and make the cuts that are appropriate when they're necessary. They ran a $70,000, $80,000 election last week on these roads in Palm Bay, and now they're talking about furloughing cops so they can make up $180,000 in a year. Don't hold the election you know is not going to pass. They want responsible management. It's not that the people in Palm Bay don't want good roads. They want responsible management out of what they're getting out of the city.
You have a special place in your heart for Palm Bay, I know, but do you think
I have a lot of fun with Palm Bay.
Do you think that what we saw with the vote in Palm Bay is indicative of what we might see countywide if they do put a school tax to a vote like this, or do you think that things are just different there given their history?
It's hard to say. I think Palm Bay, we all agree in this climate, and we don't know what next year is going to bring, that it's going to be potentially a tough sell. But I think the school district would stand a significantly better chance if it would just be focused on schools, and it would not be a very large increase to help supplement these budget shortfalls. I remember back in, I think it was 2003, they had a big bond referendum where they were going to do lots of things in Brevard County. It was money for schools and money for roads, and then everybody had their favorite. It was a disaster because
botanical gardens,
yeah, because they threw in everything but the kitchen sink. I know I had a number of people say to me then that they were going to vote against it, but if it was just for schools, they would have voted for it. They knew a lot of their friends felt the same way. That was then, this is now. But I think if you really tailor something to an issue as critical as schools, I think they stand a better chance. And what we saw with the reaction to deep budget cuts here at the forum in February is this really crosses party lines. You made, I thought, the very good observation that there were a lot of people at that forum in February where they raised a lot of heck with the state legislators. You call them lunch pail Republicans. They don't see this as a partisan issue. They want good education for their kids. This district has a superb reputation, and they want to maintain that. So maybe they have a better shot next year.
The other side, too, is what you talked about, the transparency with the Palm Bay initiative. The problem with that is the economic stimulus side of that thing. It was who knows what they're going to give to who to try to bring them in here. Had it gone just roads, it might have had a better chance. The other concern, Matt, what, 8% turnout in that election?
Very small.
And what's it going to be for the city, for the county-wide referendum if the schools go for one? I think you'll see a better turnout, but will it be much more? The voters have a responsibility here too. You got to step up and let people know what you want.
It may be the activists on both sides. Meanwhile, let's talk about a different road, the road to the governor's mansion. At least 2 notable politicians are now on that road, with Governor Charlie Crist running instead for Senate next year. Republican Attorney General Bill McCollum has announced his run. He faces Democratic Chief Financial Officer Alex Sink. Guys, I just wrote in a column that I think these are 2 really good candidates. What am I overlooking, if anything?
From my perspective, the interference of the Republican Party of Florida. We've got a problem with them already jumping in and wanting Charlie Crist unopposed in the senatorial race. You'll see them come down on somebody's side. Matter of fact, Charlie Bronson is feeling pressure from the Republican Party not to get into the governor's race on the Republican side. This belongs to the voters of both parties to decide their candidates. I think your column on Tuesday was outstanding. You've got 2 good candidates here who are right-minded people who have the best interests of the state of Florida at heart. You've got 2 basically fiscally conservative people. Alex Sink, more conservative than Charlie Crist ever thought about being. I'd rather have her governor today. So I think you've got 2 good choices there, but it's going to boil down to, do the people really get to have their say?
John?
I'd say get ready for the ultimate street fight. The Democrats with Sink, with the climate being the way it is, Obama's popularity in Florida and continues to be high according to recent polls. You take that and the opportunity of the Democrats potentially winning the governor's mansion for the first time in 12 years. If the Republicans are already making moves to force out Bronson, you're going to see the Democrats pour a ton of money into this state to try to help get Sink elected. You're going to see Obama down here a lot. There's going to be a lot of attention focused on this race in Florida because it has national implications.
Will it be campaigning for the governor, or will it be campaigning for Charlie Crist is the question?
Well, who, the president?
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of both.
Both, probably.
Yeah.
You know, I almost hate to see them attack each other because, you know, with my experience interviewing them and covering some of their issues, I mean, they seem like honest public servants, smart people, smartest people in the room, who are responsive to the public, and I've never seen them evade a question, evade an issue like you see with Charlie Crist this week. Won't talk about national issues. I don't think you'd ever see that from a Bill McCollum or an Alex Sink. And yet you said it would be a bloodbath. Is there anything about these 2 candidates that really sets one side or the other off from them? Or are they 2 positive people?
I think you'll see these 2 candidates try to stick to the issues. The problem you're going to have are some of the problems we've seen here in Brevard in previous races in the last year or so, where the outside players come in and they take it into the dirt, into the mud, and they make it very ugly, and it will get bloody. I'm already getting emails daily at work about how terrible guy Bill McCollum is or how terrible Alex Sink is. I ignore them because I'm going to talk to both of these candidates and we're going to see what they think. And if they can stay on message, if they can keep the outside players on the fringe, I think you're going to have a good race. You might have a bloodbath, John, but you're going to have a good race with a couple of good candidates. I think it's a win-win for Florida, no matter who comes out of that race.
You won't be able to keep the proxies out of this fight. And while Alex Sink and Bill McCollum can stand up straight and forthright and take the high road, you know, all the folks on the sidelines
They're gonna play,
and the
yeah.
packs, they're going to play, and that's where a lot of the dirt's going to fly. I think the real issue for them that was going to be, going back to what I initially said, as to what the legislature did not do this year. They absolutely refused. In 2 years, that stimulus money is gone. We do not know what the economy is going to be like. To rely on growth to pay for it in Florida, which has always been the construction industry and home development, forget it. Right now there's 300,000 empty homes sitting in Florida, and if you think that's going to bump, that's going to rebound to that point where those homes are going to get sold, and there's going to be a lot of new construction bringing in new tax revenue, and all that, forget it. So that's going to be the real issue next year, is really the fiscal survival of the state as you head into the next few years, and who's going to be honest in addressing it. And what I would like to see is the kind of honesty that you need to see in Washington too, where you can't just have conservatives saying we're never going to raise taxes of any kind, and you've got liberals saying we aren't ever going to cut spending on any of these programs. You got to set all that aside for the good of the state in Tallahassee and for the good of the country.
It's going to take
in
leadership
Washington.
we haven't seen yet.
And everything's got to be put on the table, and deals are going to have to be cut. Leadership is really the art of compromise, and we'll see what happens.
Well, I expect a very close race. I think it's going to be a fun one, with, again, Central Florida being a pivotal place, with swing voters really crossing over to vote for either one of these candidates, based on whether they like the fiscal stuff or the law and order issues that Bill McCollum brings to the table. Thank you, gentlemen. This has been great.
Thank you.
Well, our final topic today is hunger. It's a growing problem here on the Space Coast. Florida Today caught up with some of the people who, with the community's help, are trying to feed our fellow Floridians.
Today we're doing the distribution of the letter carriers food drive that we had on Saturday. On Saturday we collected almost 116,000 pounds of food at 5 post offices in central Brevard. We had 260 volunteers sort and box that food, brought it back to the food bank, and we have the agencies coming 5 minutes apart to pick their share of the food drive up.
We're allotted a certain amount of food, and we'll take it back to the agency, unpack it. Got a bunch of people at the church building waiting, and start handing it out when we're open.
And what kind of need is there right now?
Oh, it's huge.
Are we wrapping individually, or you want me to wrap these together?
Together, like that. Together.
Okay.
We're definitely seeing more people, no doubt about that. First of all, we see a lot more new faces. It's 1/3 of the people we see are homeless, and that's holding. We're not seeing a lot more in terms of homeless. We're also seeing a lot more people who are not homeless yet, but it could be soon. So we're seeing all areas increase. We're seeing more and more children, which is disturbing, because up until a year ago, only 4 or 5% of the people we'd see on a daily basis, other than summer months, were children.
Has hunger become a problem here in Brevard County?
Absolutely. Right now we're in the midst of the National Hunger Study. All the Second Harvest food banks are conducting that right now, and those results will come out in December. And I have my suspicions. Last hunger study 4 years ago was 1 in 10 families were in need of food assistance. I have my suspicions we're probably going to find out that it's 1 in 5 to 1 in 6 families are making choices between buying food or paying rent or mortgage or paying for medical bills.
Well, if you'd like to help, you can donate securely to Project Hunger on our website at floridatoday.com/Project Hunger, or check this week's editions of Florida Today for a mailing address. Well, that's our show for this week. My thanks to Bill, Mick, and John Glisch for their expert insight. I'm Matt Reed. See you next week.